Hello dear students, welcome back to this online tutoring alternative English class with me, your tutor, Esther Zobio. In today's class, we're going to learn about a very interesting semi-autobiography of the author Charles Lamb from the first section, which is titled Dream Children, a Reverie by Charles Lamb. First of all, let's discuss about the author Charles Lamb. Charles Lamb, 1775 to 1834, was born in London. He was the youngest child in the family. He was an English essayist and poet, best known for his Essays of Elia and for the children's book Tales from Shakespeare, co-authored with his sister Mary Lamb, and was the center of a major literary circle in England. His principal biographer, E.V. Lucas, referred him as the most lovable figure in English literature. Some of Charles Lamb's fondest childhood memories were of the time spent with Mrs. Field, who was his maternal grandmother, who was for many years a servant to the Plummer family, who owned a large country house called Blakesware, near Whitford, Hertfordshire. After the death of Mrs. Plummer, Lamb's grandmother was in sole charge of the large house, and as Plummer was often absent, Charles Lamb had free rein of the place during his visits. This essay, Dream Children, a Reverie, paints a picture of Charles Lamb's fond memories with his grandmother, Mrs. Field, and those lovely days he enjoyed at the great house in Norfolk. Writing about his imaginary wife and children in this essay reveals Lamb's wishes and desires that really never happened to him in reality. So without wasting any more time, let's just dive into a lesson to know more about it. First of all, the characters that we'll see in this essay is James Elia. James Elia is referred to Charles Lamb. Elia is the pen name for Charles Lamb. Mrs. Field is Charles Lamb's maternal grandmother. John L. is Lamb's brother. Alice W.N. is Charles Lamb's imaginary wife. John and Alice is Charles Lamb's imaginary son and daughter, and Bridget here is referred to Charles Lamb's sister. Okay, so let's get into the lesson, the story. Elia's children gather around him to hear stories about the great-grandmother Mrs. Field, who lived in a mansion that she cared for on behalf of a rich family who lived in a different mansion. Young Alice, his imaginary daughter, young Alice scoffs at Elia's recollection of a rich person removing a detailed wood carving depicting the story of the children in the wood to put up an ugly marble thing instead. Elia narrates about Mrs. Field, saying everyone praised her goodness and religious faith. She could memorize and recite Psalms and some of the New Testament. Mrs. Field was a tall, upright, and graceful person. She was a great dancer until she was stricken by cancer. But even in the grip of that disease, she didn't lose any of her good spirits. Mrs. Field was convinced that 2 ghosts of infants lived in her house, but she didn't consider them harmful, so it didn't bother her much. But the young Elia was terrified of them and always needed help getting to sleep, even though he never saw them. When Mrs. Field died, her funeral was attended by many to pay homage because she was loved and respected by all. Now, Elia goes on narrating that when he was young, he used to wander the grounds of the mansion where Mrs. Field used to live. admiring all of the marble statues and wondering when he may himself turn into one. He spent his days picking the various fruit from around the grounds of the estate. Elia breaks from his recollection and notices his children John and young Elise splitting a plate of grapes. Elia continues that Philth loved all of her grandchildren, but especially Elia's elder brother John L. John L., a handsome and great-spirited young man who rode horses from a young age. John L. used to carry Elia around on his back when Elia became lame-footed. But when John L. fell ill, Elia felt he wasn't able to take care of his brother, though John L. had cared for him. And when John L. died, Elia was reserved in emotion but consumed by a great sorrow. At this point in the telling, Elia's children started crying, asking not to say more about their uncle's sad, tragic story, but to hear about their pretty dead mother instead. So Elia begins by telling them of the 7 years he spent courting their mother, Alice W.N., with all of its difficulties and rejection. But when he goes to look at his daughter, Alice, she has disappeared. A disembodied voice tells Elia that they are not Alice's children nor his, and that the real father of Alice's children is a man named Bartram, and they are just dreams. With that, Elia wakes up from his dream and found himself in his bachelor armchair with his sister Bridget by his side. But he realized that John L., his brother, was gone forever. So that's the brief summary of the lesson, Dream Children, a Reverie. Let's discuss the theme of the lesson. The theme that we see in this lesson is regret and loss. Regret for unfulfilled love and joy, lost hope, lost opportunities, and lost joys of life. In his actual life, Charles Lamb courted a lady named Anne Simmons, but could not marry her. He wanted to have children, but could not have any. Thus, he strikes a pathetic note towards the end of his essays when he puts the following word into the mouths of his imaginary children, who said, "We are not of Alice, nor of thee, nor are we children at all. We are nothing, less than nothing but dreams. We are only what might have been." So Alice here is referred to Anne Simmons, the girl Lamb wanted to marry but failed to marry her. In fact, the subtitle of the essay, a reverie, which literally means a daydream or a fantasy, prepares us for the pathos of the return to reality, although the essay begins on a deceptively realistic note. Although Dream Children begins on a merry note, the dark side of life soon forces itself upon Lamb's attention, and the comic attitude gives way to melancholy at the end of the essay. Throughout the essay, Lamb presents his children in such a way that we never guess that they are merely figments of his imagination. It is only at the end of the essay that we realize that the entire episode with his children is a daydream. We are awakened by the painful realization of the facts. Dream Children is a beautiful projection of Lamb's feelings and desires to have a wife and children of his own. It is humorous that in his dream he is married and has 2 children of his own, while he had a disheartening frustration in love. Thus, Lamb has painted both the lights and the shades of life in full circle. He is the criticism of life in pathos and humor. So students, with that we come to the end of our lesson for Dream Children, a Reverie by Charles Lamb.